In the year 2015, in a quiet churchyard in eastern England, archaeologists lifted a skeleton out of the ground. She had been buried there for over 1,000 years. The dig team gave her a name to work with, since her real one was lost to time. They called her Wren. Wren had been buried with care, close to an early stone church, her arms folded gently across her chest in the Christian style of the time. But when scientists tested her DNA, something did not add up. Wren's genetic code did not match the people buried near her only 100 years earlier in the same small patch of ground. Somehow, in just a few generations, the DNA of an entire community had shifted. New ancestry had entered the bloodline, and it kept happening, grave after grave, all across the region, all around the same time that a new religion was settling into England for good. What happened to Wren's community did not happen by accident, and it did not happen only in England. It happened, in one form or another, almost everywhere Christianity took root across Europe. The question this raises is a strange one, and it is the question this whole story is built around. How does a religion, a set of beliefs about God and the soul, end up rewriting the DNA of an entire continent? Not its politics, not its language, its actual genes, passed from parent to child for 1,000 years. At first, the archaeologists studying Wren's grave assumed they had simply found an outsider, one traveler buried far from her birthplace by chance. But as they tested more skeletons from the same churchyard, spanning several generations, the pattern kept repeating. It was not one traveler. It was a slow, steady wave, showing up grave after grave, always tracking alongside the spread of the new religion. Something about Christianity itself, not just the people who happened to carry it into England, was reshaping who these communities were, biologically, one generation at a time. The answer starts with something almost boring on the surface. It starts with a rule about marriage. Long before Christianity spread across Europe, marrying a cousin was completely normal. In fact, it was often the smart choice. If you married someone from your own extended family, land stayed in the family. Power stayed close. Alliances between powerful houses grew stronger instead of scattering outward. This was true almost everywhere in the ancient world, from Roman senators to small farming villages in the north. Wren's own ancestors, generations back, very likely lived this way too, marrying within a tight, familiar circle. Then the church began telling people this had to stop. Starting in the early centuries after Christianity became the religion of Rome, church leaders slowly built a wall of rules around marriage. First, they banned marrying a close cousin. Then, they extended the ban further to second cousins, and eventually to relatives, so distant that most people could not even trace the connection. In some periods, the rules were so strict that a person needed to search outside their entire village, sometimes outside their whole region, just to find someone the church would allow them to marry. At first, this might sound like a small administrative detail, a line in an old book of church law. It was not small at all. It was one of the most powerful genetic interventions in human history, and it happened almost invisibly, one wedding at a time, for century after century. The church did not simply suggest this rule, it enforced it publicly and carefully. Before a wedding could happen, priests were required to announce the couple's names out loud in church, sometimes for 3 weeks in a row, asking the whole community to speak up if they knew of any hidden blood relation between the two families. This announcement was called the Banns of Marriage, and it turned every wedding into a small, public genetic investigation, carried out by neighbors who often knew local family trees better than any written record could. Over time, church councils kept adjusting exactly how distant a relation had to be before marriage was allowed. At one major church council held in the year 1215, leaders actually loosened the rule slightly because it had become so strict and so widely enforced that many communities were struggling to find anyone eligible to marry at all. Think about what that means. The rule was not just real, it was at times almost too effective, forcing entire communities to search further and further from home simply to follow it. Think about what this actually meant for a single village. Before the rule, a young man might marry the daughter of his own uncle, someone who lived 2 houses down, whose family history he already knew by heart. After the rule, he had to look further. He had to travel to the next village, or the village after that, to find a bride the church would approve of. Multiply that single decision by millions of couples, repeated generation after generation, for well over 1,000 years, and you get something remarkable. You get a slow, steady mixing of bloodlines across huge stretches of the map, all driven by a religious rule that had nothing to do with genetics at all, because nobody at the time even understood what genetics was. Modern scientists have actually measured this. Researchers studying human genomes today can detect signs of inbreeding, tiny genetic fingerprints left behind when parents are closely related. When these scientists compare regions of Europe that lived under strict church marriage law for the longest time against regions where the rule arrived later or applied more loosely, the pattern is unmistakable. Long-term Western Church regions show dramatically lower rates of historical inbreeding. The DNA of these populations is more mixed, more spread out, drawn from a wider genetic pool. Wren's world, an early Christian community in England, sat right at the center of this shift. Her genetic difference from the generation before her was not a strange coincidence. It was the rule working exactly as it would keep working, quietly, for 1,000 years across an entire continent. This marriage rule is the spine of the whole story we're about to tell. Everything else we cover, every region, every migration, every monastery, connects back to this one simple, world-changing idea. The church did not just ask people what to believe. It told them who they could love, who they could marry, and who they could have children with. And because of that, it reshaped the human gene pool of Europe more thoroughly than almost any war or empire ever did. There was a second mechanism working alongside the marriage rule, and it worked in the opposite direction. Instead of pushing bloodlines outward, it removed some bloodlines from the population entirely. As Christianity grew stronger, so did the practice of celibacy. Monks and nuns took vows never to marry, never to have children. In small numbers, this barely mattered. But in some regions during the medieval period, religious life grew enormous. In certain towns, 10% of the population or more entered monasteries and convents, choosing lives without children. Picture a family in a small medieval town. They have 5 children. Under the older, pre-Christian pattern, most or all of those children would eventually marry and have families of their own, continuing the bloodline in 5 separate directions. Now picture the same family a few centuries later, deep into the Christian era. Perhaps one son becomes a priest, perhaps a daughter, especially if the family already has other children set to inherit land, is sent to a convent instead of being married off. Suddenly, 2 of those 5 branches simply stop. They do not fail, they do not die out from disease or misfortune. They are set aside deliberately for religious reasons, and the family's genetic future narrows because of it. Every one of those people represented a bloodline that simply stopped. A family that might have grown across 10 generations instead ended in 1. Meanwhile, families that stayed outside religious life kept having children as before, so their share of the population and their genetic influence grew larger by comparison. Picture it like a river system. The marriage rule was constantly pulling new water in from distant streams, mixing everything together. Monastic celibacy was quietly damming off certain smaller streams entirely, letting them run dry. Both forces, one adding, one subtracting, worked on the same population, at the same time, for the same reason. Together, they explain far more about the genetic history of Europe than either one could alone. Now, let's go back to Wren and to England, because her story is where these forces first become visible in the ancient DNA record. Before Christianity firmly took hold, England was home to Celtic populations whose ancestry had been shaped mostly by earlier waves of migration going back thousands of years. Then, in the years following the collapse of Roman rule, groups from what is now Germany and Denmark, often called Anglo-Saxons, began crossing the sea and settling across much of the island. Ancient DNA pulled from graves like Wren's shows this shift clearly. New genetic ancestry, closely matching populations from the European mainland, appears layered on top of the older Celtic signal, growing stronger in each generation's burials. This migration and the spread of Christianity moved together, feeding each other. Christian kingdoms in England welcomed new Christian settlers from the continent, offering them land, protection, and status, which helped new bloodlines take root and grow. At the same time, church marriage law was already beginning its slow work, pulling communities like Wren's outward, away from the tight, closed marriage patterns of earlier centuries. By the time later, generations were buried in the same churchyard as Wren. Their DNA told the story of a population that had been steadily opening outward for 100 years. One wedding, one newcomer, one church rule at a time. We cannot know Wren's husband's name or exactly where he was born, but her own genetic profile gives us a strong clue about her family's story. Somewhere in the generation just before her, someone in her family line likely married outward, following the very rule we just described, reaching past the small, familiar circle their grandparents would have chosen from. Maybe it was Wren herself. Maybe it was her mother, or her mother's mother. Somewhere in that short chain of marriages, following a rule written in a language most of them could not even read, her family's bloodline quietly joined the larger, mixing river flowing across early Christian England. Ireland gives us a sharper, more dramatic version of the same pattern, because Ireland shows what happens when the marriage rule runs into resistance. Irish monasteries became famous across early medieval Europe as centers of learning, sending missionaries as far as Scotland, France, and Germany. These monasteries copied ancient texts by candlelight, trained generations of scholars, and sent a steady stream of monks across the sea to found new religious communities on foreign soil. In this sense, Ireland was every bit as devoted to spreading the faith as anywhere else in Europe, arguably more so. Yet Ireland's own ruling families held onto older marriage customs, including marriage between relatives, for longer than many parts of the continent. often for political reasons tied to keeping land and power inside powerful dynasties. This makes Ireland a kind of natural experiment. It shows a population that embraced Christian belief with enormous energy while quietly resisting the church's marriage rule at the highest levels of power. Ordinary Irish families may well have followed the rule closely, just as families did elsewhere. But among kings and chieftains, where marriage was also a political tool for building alliances and consolidating territory, old habits proved harder to give up. Power, it turns out, was sometimes strong enough to bend even the church's strictest rules. The genetic evidence backs this up in a striking way. Researchers studying the Y chromosome, the piece of DNA passed almost unchanged from father to son, found that an unusually large number of men across Ireland and parts of Scotland share a single common paternal ancestor from over 1,000 years ago. Historians connect this shared ancestry to a powerful medieval dynasty whose sons had extraordinary numbers of descendants across many generations. It is a clear sign of concentrated power translating directly into concentrated genetics, precisely the kind of pattern the church's marriage rule was designed to slowly break apart everywhere else. Ireland shows us the exception that proves how powerful the rule really was, because where the rule was resisted, the old pattern of tightly concentrated bloodlines survived far longer. This is why Ireland matters so much to the larger case being built here. It is not just an interesting side story. It is a direct test of the marriage rule's power, run naturally, across real families, over real centuries. Where the rule was followed closely, as in Wren's England, bloodlines opened outward and mixed. Where the rule was resisted, as among Ireland's ruling families, bloodlines stayed concentrated, and the genetic fingerprint of that resistance is still visible in living men today. The two patterns, sitting side by side in the same historical period, make it very hard to explain this genetic shift as random chance. If Wren represents one end of this story, the ordinary family that quietly followed the rule and blended into the wider population, then Ireland's medieval kings represent the other end, the powerful family that bent the rule and left a concentrated genetic mark instead. Between these two extremes lies almost everyone else in medieval Europe, and the balance between them, family by family, region by region, is what ultimately produced the genetic map scientists are still piecing together today. Eastern Europe offers the clearest contrast of all, and it completes the picture the marriage rule started. Christianity arrived in the East later than in the West, and it arrived through a different branch of the church, based not in Rome but in Constantinople. This Eastern church never enforced the marriage ban with the same strictness as the Western church did. Because of this, regions across the Balkans, Russia, and much of Eastern Europe kept larger extended family structures and higher rates of marriage between distant relatives for centuries longer than Western Europe did. When modern scientists map genetic patterns of family relatedness across the continent today, this old religious boundary still shows up with startling clarity. It forms an invisible line, still traceable in living DNA today, that follows almost exactly the ancient border between the Western and Eastern branches of the Christian Church. On one side, centuries of strict marriage law produced a widely mixed, genetically diverse population. On the other side, a more relaxed set of rules allowed older patterns of close family marriage to continue for much longer. This Eastern comparison is not a side note. It is the strongest piece of evidence we have that the marriage rule itself, more than migration or war or plague, was the true engine driving this genetic transformation. It helps to be specific about why the Eastern Church took a different path. Its leaders were based in Constantinople, far from Rome, and they answered to different councils, different emperors, and different local customs built up over centuries. While the Western Church kept expanding its list of forbidden marriage partners, reaching further and further into a family tree, the Eastern Church generally kept its rules closer to the original, narrower boundaries. Extended family networks, including some marriages between more distant cousins, remained socially acceptable in many Eastern Christian communities long after they had become rare or forbidden in the West. This was not a difference in how strongly people believed. Eastern Christians were every bit as devoted as Western ones. It was a difference in one specific rule, applied differently by two branches of the same faith, and that single difference is still readable in DNA collected from living people across the continent today. Similar patterns show up further south, in Iberia, where Christian kingdoms slowly expanded across the peninsula over several centuries, resettling newly won land with families moving down from the north. Ancient DNA from medieval Iberian graves tracks this southward spread with remarkable precision, ancestry patterns shifting decade by decade, following almost exactly the same pace as Christian political control moving across the map. It is the marriage rule and the migration pattern working together again. The same twin engines we saw in England, just wearing a different regional costume. A handful of smaller, isolated populations round out the picture, almost like a control group in an experiment. The Sami people of the far north held onto their own spiritual traditions long after neighboring kingdoms converted, and their DNA today still shows a more isolated ancestry pattern than most of Europe. The Basque people, tucked into the mountains between Spain and France, adopted Christianity fairly early, but their rugged geography kept them somewhat separated from the wider mixing happening elsewhere, and their genetics today still carry unusually deep, distinct roots. These groups did not experience the marriage rule and the migration pressure in quite the same way as places like England or Iberia, and their DNA shows it. They are the exceptions that confirm the rule was doing exactly what the evidence elsewhere suggests. One more force worked quietly alongside the marriage rule, reinforcing it rather than competing with it. As churches multiplied across Europe, so did the roads and paths connecting them. Pilgrims traveled long distances to visit holy sites, sometimes for weeks or months at a time. Traders moved goods, protected in part by the growing web of Christian kingdoms that wanted safe passage between churches, monasteries, and market towns. Every one of these journeys created new chances for people to meet someone from far outside their own village, exactly the kind of match the marriage rule was already pushing families to seek out. The rule created the need to search farther from home. Pilgrimage and trade created the roads that made that search possible. The two forces fit together like a key and a lock, and together they explain why the genetic mixing shows up so clearly and so consistently in the archaeological record, region after region, century after century. So what happened to Wren, and to thousands of people like her, buried in churchyards across a changing continent? Her DNA tells a story that no history book could have told on its own. She lived at the exact moment two enormous forces were reshaping the genetic makeup of her world. A marriage rule, quietly pulling her community's bloodlines outward, generation after generation. And a wave of migration and settlement, arriving alongside the same new religion that shaped how she was buried, arms folded, facing east, in the Christian style. She was not just a woman who happened to live during a religious change. Her body, and the bodies of her children and her children's children, were the physical record of that change, written into DNA 1,000 years before anyone knew DNA existed. It is worth being honest about the limits of this story too, because ancient DNA research is still a young science, changing fast as new techniques and new samples come in every year. Not every genetic shift across medieval Europe was caused by Christianity alone. War, plague, trade, and simple population growth all played their own parts, often at the very same time as religious change was unfolding. Religion rarely works alone. It works alongside politics, economics, and the ordinary. Practical choices people make about where to live and who to love. The Black Death, sweeping across Europe in the 1300s, is a good example of how these forces tangled together. When plague wiped out entire villages, survivors often resettled into new communities, and the church, still the most organized institution across much of the continent, frequently helped coordinate exactly where people went and who took over abandoned land. Ancient DNA from plague-era burial pits shows clear evidence of new population mixing following this crisis, mixing that would not have looked the same without the church's role in reorganizing shattered communities. It is a reminder that the marriage rule was the strongest thread in this story, but never the only one. But even accounting for all of that, the pattern connected to church marriage law is one of the clearest, most consistently measured genetic signals scientists have found linking a belief system directly to the DNA of the people who lived under it. It is worth pausing to explain how scientists can even know something this detailed about a woman who died 1,000 years ago. Ancient DNA does not usually survive well in blood or hair. It survives best deep inside a small, extremely dense bone near the ear, called the petrous bone, which protects fragile genetic material far better than almost any other part of the skeleton. Researchers drill a tiny sample from this bone, break it down in the lab, and search for surviving fragments of genetic code, fragments that are often damaged and broken after so many centuries underground. Powerful computers then piece those fragments back together, letter by letter, comparing them against huge databases built from thousands of other ancient and modern samples. It is slow, careful work, closer to solving a puzzle than reading a book. But it lets scientists do something that would have seemed impossible only a generation ago: line up burial after burial across hundreds of years and watch a population's ancestry shift in something close to real time. Today, if archaeologists opened Wren's grave again with the tools available now, they could read her genome in a matter of days and compare her instantly against thousands of other ancient people across the continent. That kind of comparison is exactly how this whole story came into focus. One grave at a time, one small shift in ancestry at a time, until a pattern too large to be a coincidence finally became impossible to ignore. Somewhere in that quiet English churchyard, Wren's bones still hold the answer to a question no one thought to ask her while she was alive. Did she know her marriage, her children, her whole small life was part of something so much larger? Almost certainly not. She was simply living, loving, and burying her own family members according to the rules and beliefs of her time. She likely never once thought of herself as part of a genetic experiment stretching across a continent. She was thinking about her children, her harvest, her prayers, her small patch of English soil, and yet picture her one more time, standing at the door of that little stone church on the day she was married. Somewhere in the crowd behind her stood the priest who had already announced her name for 3 Sundays in a row, asking the whole village whether anyone knew of a hidden blood tie between her family and her husband's. No one had spoken up. The marriage went ahead, a child was born, then another, and with each birth, a little more of the wider, mixing bloodstream of Christian Europe flowed into her family line, joining a river that had already been building for generations before her, and would keep building for centuries after her. 1,000 years later, her bones are still speaking, telling us that belief does not only live in the mind. Sometimes it writes itself directly into the blood, and it stays there, waiting quietly in the dark until someone finally learns how to read it. Wren never knew her own story would end up here, told to strangers 1,000 years in the future. She never knew her small, private choice of who to marry would one day sit inside a scientific paper cited as one tiny data point in a map of an entire continent's history. But her DNA remembered it anyway, long after everyone who knew her name had turned to dust, long after the little stone church beside her grave had crumbled and been rebuilt and rebuilt again. In the end, that is what this whole story is really about. Not kings, not councils, not even the church itself, but ordinary people like Wren, whose quiet, private choices, repeated by millions of others across 1,000 years, turned out to be powerful enough to rewrite the genetic map of Europe.